My name's Tristan McLean. I'm the Knowledge Mobilization and Communications Coordinator for PermafrostNet, and I will be delivering today's workshop in combination with Clara Kaiser. So thank you very much for joining us. Social Media 101 is this week's workshop. So what we're going to cover in this workshop are the key features of social media. We want to find ways for you to think about what you want to achieve out of using social media. What's your goals and your aims? And how can you use research and evidence to improve the effectiveness of your use of social media? We'll have a little think about the pros and cons of using social media, and we'll share with you some of the evidence there is around the best practices. First of all, the big question is, what is social media? And so what I'd like to do at this point is I'm going to open up a whiteboard, and I'd invite you to all contribute what you think of when you think of social media, what it is. And I'm not saying here that we'd like your suggestions of types of social media, platforms like Twitter. We can move on to that in a bit later. But what are the features? What makes media social media? You can choose text and you can type and make a little text box and you can type your thoughts. I see Adam there, excellent, a place to share news, ideas, updates with friends, colleagues and the general public. Platforms that allow to engage with a wide general audience.
I'm going to read out what's coming in the chat. So, interaction between the person that posts something and the audience from Frederick. E. Marcus is saying platforms that allow to engage with a wide general audience. Mohammed Hussein is saying a tool to communicate with other people in different manners and interact with them.
Accessible to everyone we have here on the whiteboard. To exchange ideas, share info, virtual community, place where information and misinformation can easily be shared with others. A forum with few rules. Yes, that gives you the opportunity to be very creative. You don't have the same restrictions you might in other places. To reach out to people you don't have a chance to communicate with in person. Visual components and text is usually somewhat minimal. A source of entertainment, like that. Forms of communication to engage with others in an open environment. I can post that in Teams afterwards if you want to come back and have a little look. And what I will do now is I'll go back to the presentation. We can move on. We had a little think about what social media is. And social media is changing. It's a technology. It advances over time. And it's evolved since it first began. And there's debate that it's not a unique form of communication on the internet. But ultimately, the way that it tends to be defined is it's interactive Web 2.0 applications. User-generated, so they generate content by the user. They have profiles, so that's one of the features, that they have a profile that a user will fill out a photo or some sort of information. And then there's networks that connect these in between all of these profiles. So unlike a static web page, maybe your sort of Web 1.0, where there was no way to leave a comment or interact with it, the Web 2.0 applications, the social media, is different because people can interact in different ways. It does change, and as we'll see as we go through this, there are different types of social media that have different elements of interactivity, and they have different ways that people can share information and connect with other people, and they can influence the way you might want to use them. In our next little activity, what I want us to give a little try is to think about what are the social media platforms that we know of and that we maybe use or think about using. So I can see everyone's putting in platforms they can think of. Facebook's up there. This is a live word cloud. So hopefully you can all see, I'm showing this now on my screen. And the size of the word represents the number of occurrences. All right, can you see that? Excellent. So this is a really good way to get a quick visual feel for how much, in this case, everyone thinks about certain social media platforms. And as you can see, Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook, they jump right out. They're pretty obvious and big up there. I like that I see a little one in there, Strava, right in there in the middle. I'm on Strava, and I use it every day, and I hadn't thought to include it in today's presentation. I guess it's more my personal social media rather than professional. This is great. I love all of the contributions we've got here. See if everyone's all maxed out. Oh, we've got some more changes.
Julia's mentioned that she's forgotten Reddit.
What I did here is, as you see on this slide, I had a little look over the social media platforms that were submitted in the pre-workshop survey. So when everyone filled out their pre-workshop evaluation, these are the platforms that tend to be used by the researchers in the network. And as you can see there, it's very similar. The big platforms, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, are there. But the most common platform that everyone is familiar with and is very popular, obviously, is LinkedIn. A lot of people are on LinkedIn, which is very useful for us. Lets us know that that's going to be a good way to connect with members of our network. And it's also really useful for thinking about ways we can support you. ResearchGate is also there. It's very interesting. I think that's somewhere we can look at working on social media engagement. But as you could all see, from all of the different platforms that you know of and think of, there are a lot of platforms. And there may be opportunities to use some of these for your communications. So this is what I pulled together. I pulled together a selection of the most popular and well-known social media channels in most cases. So LinkedIn, Facebook, Pinterest. And if you were with us for last week's science communication workshop, we did say how science communication and science, they're a part of culture. They're a part of our world. And there's loads and loads of ways that you can be creative and reach audiences and communicate with people. So there's no reason that you can't use almost any social media platform if the goals that you have for your communications would be supported by using that tool. So if you like producing videos, YouTube is going to be a fantastic platform to use. If you produce a lot of nice visually appealing crafts, or you bake, or you have some other curation type of activity, then Pinterest could be the platform for you. There are also some specific science platforms like ResearchGate and Mendeley that can be really specifically useful if you want to share your research. Now, when you want to choose your social media platform, it is obviously very important to think about the reach. And as you may be aware, Facebook is, got billions of users. It's a really, really, really big platform. There is a number of sources where you can find out data on the usage of social media platforms. Statista is a good place to find out things like this, like what's popular in different countries. If there's a certain country that you want to sort of target, you might want to look at that. What's the usage of social media in India versus North America, for instance. This here shows you just how many people worldwide are actively using social media 2020. And you can see some of those top platforms are probably no surprise. Facebook, YouTube, WhatsApp is up there. This is primarily a communicating sort of messaging platform, but you can have group chats and you can share images and that sort of thing on that platform. So it's one way to potentially reach people. You see Instagram, TikTok, Snapchat, Twitter, all there. Lots and lots of opportunities and possibilities for how you want to communicate and where you want to communicate. The pros and cons of social media. Any particular feature of social media typically has the potential to be both a tool for and a barrier to effective communication. Now, I think this just sums it all up. It's a brilliant quote. It really is true that you are going to find things that social media enables you to do, and you've got to think about how there could be barriers as well. So all of the things that it enables you to do, like sharing images, reaching a large number of people, might be limited by the platform itself and other factors. The most important thing about social media is it enables two-way communication. So unlike the traditional media that we had before social media, where you have a web page and you can provide some information there, you couldn't have a conversation, you couldn't receive comments, and you couldn't get feedback. And that was very much like it was in old sort of traditional media, like newspapers or the radio or the TV. And the thing that really social media has brought about is that this new ability to have those two-way conversations. But it does bring some challenges, as we may be aware of some of them, like echo chambers and the way that algorithms will decide what you see. The important factors that you want to really sort of think about what are going to be impacting your science communication through social media are things like the platform and those search engine algorithms. And they can determine what information you're going to see, as well as what information people you're trying to communicate are going to see. We often don't know how these private companies design their algorithms and what objectives and motivations they have when they're trying to present content that is generated by the user to people on their news feeds or however the platform's structured. But they can quite substantially alter the way that you interact with your audiences. So that's something that you want to try and find out about and be a bit aware of when you're choosing your platform and when you're communicating. This can lead to filter bubbles. It can create silos. It can create groups of people who are maybe not communicating more widely, not sharing information, or starting to just get information reinforced. And that can be negative in some ways. There are filter bubbles that can affect the way that you actually get information. So some of these silos and the way the algorithms work will stop all of the information reaching you or maybe getting out to your audiences. And this can have an impact, because in some ways it may mean that you're only going to be reaching other people who are already interested in science. They're already looking for science content, so they've clicked on a lot of science-related content in the past, and then they get shown similar content in the future. And therefore you may find it difficult to reach out to groups who ordinarily wouldn't be interested in science and research kinds of topics. So this can affect who the users that you're reaching are, who the audiences you're reaching. The platforms themselves may also influence this. You may find people who are using TikTok are maybe sort of early adopters. They're more willing to embrace new platforms. They're more likely to have mobile devices. And they may be a different sort of audience than if you're communicating on ResearchGate. On ResearchGate, you're obviously much more likely to reach your peers and other researchers. So all of these factors can influence them. The layout and the site design contribute to this. So If you're looking at something like Instagram, it's obviously very focused on images, and it's much harder to maybe share links if you're wanting to share links with people. So all of these are things to worth bearing in mind, and Farah's going to take a little closer look at some of the popular platforms, but bear in mind that these platforms are often changing, updating and modifying. So you do have to stay aware that things can change as time goes by. A lot of the platforms have certain strong features. You're all familiar with YouTube. It's very video focused. It's unlikely to change from that, but it may alter the way that it displays suggested videos and other things you might like to watch. So what it all comes back to ultimately is, what are you trying to achieve? What do you actually want to achieve through your social media? Next, what I'd like you to do is, we'll give this little whiteboard another go. Now you've had a little try, and see if you can provide some examples of why you'd like to use social media for your communications. Fantastic feedback, because it really made it clear that you already have a good grasp of some of the main reasons that researchers use social media. And one of the most obvious and straightforward motivations is going to be to increase people reading your papers, reading about your research and finding out about it. So it's one of the first things you might think about. It can increase citation rates and get more attention for your research. And this can be measured through altmetrics. So alternative ways of measuring the impact of research. This is an example of how that's sometimes gathered together. There are platforms like altmetrics run by Digital Science, and they will look around on the internet and they'll be able to collect places that research is mentioned and featured. So whether it's blogged, whether it's tweeted on Facebook, in this case, Mendeley, is it being read on Mendeley? Does it feature in the news? So they can gather together this information. It is worth pointing out that when you're looking at the altmetrics, these can be influenced by how the service that collects this data gathers the information. And you may notice that there's going to be a little bit of bias, because there's only a select number of platforms here where data is collected, primarily tweeting and Facebook. So you might have some research that's getting a huge amount of traction on TikTok, and it wouldn't be picked up here. And sources like this have also previously been discussed in relation to who runs them and the influences they may have in terms of publishers wanting to direct people to certain research and published maybe in journals that they own. So it's always worth bearing in mind. There has been research, and we'll have a little look at that, about how effectively you can get your research out there to people. And it's been found that we'll look at Ocean Sea Ice NPI, which is an Instagram account, and a number of other channels, Twitter and Facebook, that a research group used to share their science. And they actually looked at it, and they found that the average altmetric score, when they put it, when they put their research out on Twitter and Facebook, was 24.3, whereas their altmetric score that they didn't highlight on social media was only 2.1. So definitely using social media can increase the spread, the distribution, and the number of people who are going to come across your work and see it. Why do scientists use social media? Back to that question. As you can see, I mainly focus there on citation rates, but there are lots and lots of other reasons that scientists would use it. as I mentioned, is two-way communication. It enables you to have that two-way engagement with the audiences and the people you want to connect with. You can reach select audiences. You can find groups of people who have the interest or the concerns, or they want to gain the information that you want by choosing the right platforms and the right places. You may find the right Facebook group where you can communicate your research to people. And it also provides you a way to, as someone pointed out, someone made it in the feedback on our whiteboard, a way to show what it's like in the average day for a scientist. It shows the background. You get photos and what life as a scientist like, what we do as researchers. It enables you to communicate with your peers and organizations and media, and that was also seen in the feedback. It's ways that you can interact at conferences. You can follow conferences, and you can discuss things without actually physically being there. So these are ways that you can use them, and clearly you all know about that already. Now, this has actually been looked at. So people have studied this and they've written up peer-reviewed articles. As you'll know from my workshops, I'm a big fan of evidence-based communication and using the evidence that we have to direct the strategies that we take. In this case, this is it's a 2016 paper, specifically looking at what scientists are doing on social media, how they're using it. And they did find that Facebook is a very good place for having questions and getting feedback, but it does struggle a little if your goal is to develop scientific literacy and have long ongoing conversations. It can be more challenging, but it's a good place to start. They found that Twitter is very heavily used and commonly used for scientists to talk with each other and to discuss things with each other and to share their research publicly, and also to engage with the media and journalists. It can be a good place to make those connections, that your work gets out there, or maybe you're invited to give a radio interview and that sort of thing. So there are different advantages to different platforms, and they found these are the reasons that people are using them that we've already mentioned and we mentioned in the whiteboard. Choosing your social media platform. You want to choose your communication goals, as we always talk about, how much engagement you want, and the resources you have for engagement. You may want to have a lot of conversation. You may go to somewhere like Twitter, or you may want to simply gather some more information. So you may look at maybe something like YouTube, where there's going to be comments on videos, but maybe a little less discussion back and forth between you and your audiences. The types of topics that you're covering, we talked a bit about that. You may choose Pinterest as a place to share information differently than if you're using ResearchGate or Mendeley. And then the platform layout and design. And as I mentioned, that can influence the amount of two-way communication you have. There are lots and lots of guides. I will be providing a lot of guides in the Teams platform, so that you'll have lots of links to the papers that we referenced today and 2 guides where you can go for further information. Social media platforms are constantly changing, so it's always worthwhile trying to find some of the most up-to-date guides. A couple of places I would recommend would be Research Impact Canada. They have some help if you want to get into social media strategies, and also the American Geophysical Union. They have a great little table that might help you if you're still trying to decide which platform to use, that you can download and take a look at. So those are 2 that I would definitely say are good places to start with. And research papers. As I said, we're going to be providing links to other papers where you can read about the evidence that there is. They generally fall into a few different sort of categories. There are analytical studies where people have looked at data, and in some cases they've looked at big network analysis, big analysis of data, and They can see where all of the conversation is going on. There's been some very good papers that have looked at the amount of communication going on around climate change and who people communicate with, and how much information is transferred between scientists and policymakers or the media. There's been some really good work done on vaccines and anti-vaccine groups, and the sort of the silos, the echo chambers that can build online, and some really good big data analytics work done on that. There's some very practical guides. So I already mentioned the Ocean Sea Ice NPI accounts, and they've done a great paper that looks at the impact of using social media over 3 years, what they went through to find out what was effective and what wasn't effective. Now, one of the big challenges with any research and evidence that's gathered on social media is this moves very, very quickly. Social media changes and adapts very, very quickly. Snapchat was all the rage for a while. Now TikTok's one of the most popular upcoming platforms that people are using, that didn't exist only a few years ago. If we went back just 10 years ago, it was a completely different landscape. So it moves very quickly, and that's definitely one of the challenges. On top of what you might find in peer-reviewed journals talking about social media and use for science communication, you'll also come across a lot of evidence collected by marketing companies and big data companies who are looking at the impact of, broadly outside of just research and science communication, people's use of social media platforms. And there's huge amounts of this data. You can go to Sprout Social, Hootsuite, and they provide some really great guides. So if you want to try and work out when is the most engagement for a certain topic, maybe it's tech or healthcare, then you can go and you can get one of these. You can get one of these heat maps, and it'll show you the time of day, days of the week when there's a lot of activity around this topic. So if you really want to, get right down to, fine tuning your strategies, you can use some of this data if you wish. Bearing in mind, you'll want to have a little think about the time zones of your audiences and where you are. So there's loads of this data if you really want to get into it. Now, I mentioned the Ocean Sea Ice NPI account. Now, this is a research group it's less than 20 researchers, and they documented the growth of their platforms over 3 years. Now, it's primarily Instagram. So they started off with Instagram, and they have a lot of images. So there's one of the big strengths that they as a group have is they're generating content. And you may have heard the term content is king. And in this case, it was images. They produced lots of really great images, and they looked at how their followers grew over 3 years, and they also took on Facebook and Twitter accounts. I already mentioned how they saw posting on those to give them a big boost in their altmetric measures. When they were looking at their Instagram, they got a really, really good growth by having a set strategy. And I invite you to take a look at the paper to see how they went about increasing their follower growth. What I would say is that they didn't have a really good goal for what they were going to achieve. They wanted to make their science more broadly accessible and seen, but they measured it in terms of followers. So they were very focused on just increasing the number of followers that they had, which is all well and good. But if your goal is to increase science literacy or talk about a certain subject with a certain audience, just growing your audience by itself won't necessarily achieve that. So I'm now going to pass over to Farah, and she's going to give us a little bit of a lowdown on some of the specific platforms.
So at this point, we've kind of discussed how we would define social media, what you would use social media for, and kind of the big platforms. I'm going to walk you through examples of how people actively today are using social media to communicate science to kind of get you thinking about how you can do the same. And before I start, I just want to contextualize this in the context of Canada. So, this is a study from the Ryerson Social Media Lab. They survey social media use in Canada. They did this in 2017. They did this again in 2020. And you can see that right now, Canadian adults with a social media account, this is a sample size of 1,500. Facebook is still kind of the supreme leader here. It's been pretty consistent between 2020 and 2017. This is followed by messaging apps. You kind of see that they've lumped them all together. So things like WhatsApp, Signal, and so on. Then you've got YouTube, followed by Instagram, LinkedIn, Twitter, Pinterest, Snapchat, Reddit. TikTok is new. They didn't examine this in 2017. Tumblr and Twitch for video streaming. And I do want to flag that in terms of use, around 60 to 80% of folks do tend to use their social media platform at least once a day. So, in terms of using Facebook, so I imagine that many of you may still have a Facebook account because that was very popular in the last few years. In terms of Facebook, there are a few different types of engagements. So you can do a regular post where you're sharing text, video, or an image. You can use something like Facebook Live, either through your own account or through an organization's account to kind of stream an event or a talk to a larger audience and save it for access later. And then, of course, there are Facebook groups where you get many people. It can be small number of people, like tens or hundreds or thousands, kind of coming around a shared topic, whether that is vaccinations, whether it's a mom's group, or whether it's just sharing science generally, or maybe it's kind of a local community. So, a lot of different avenues for engagement. In terms of how people are using Facebook actively to share science, so one example is the Monterey Bay Aquarium Research Institute. This is an example of a little crab, and they've got a photo to catch people's eye, they've got text. You can kind of see that call to actions, like, is it a little crowded in here, to kind of convince people to click see more and see all the text. And they've given a link for people to learn more. You can see that this worked. You can see that people liked it and people shared it. But this is also an aquarium with an established page, so they've already kind of built up those followers. You can also see another organization, so this one's Canadians, the Royal Canadian Institute of Science. They use their page for a number of different things, usually to promote their events or things that have been written, and they stream their events live, so you can kind of see people do tune in, especially during the pandemic, to see this from the comfort of their own homes. And then there are Facebook groups such as the STEM Squad, which is kind of the supportive space for folks who are completing their STEM degrees. So you can kind of see that there are multiple spaces. There are like public facing spaces who want to reach different stakeholders. And there are also kind of spaces dedicated to just scientists where you can kind of find support. It all comes down to how you use your Facebook account. I'm going to be running through platforms in terms of like decreasing usage. So the next one on my list is YouTube and TikTok, and I am going to play this video. So ASAP Science use someone you might recall. They are Canadian YouTubers. They've been making videos for a long time, and their style generally has been animated videos. So they will just set up their camera and draw on a whiteboard as they break down a science topic. This here is an example of climate change with Bill Nye.
You've likely heard about the effects that climate change is having on our planet, and specifically in the Arctic, which is warming twice as fast. But what would actually happen if all the ice melted on Earth?
I can help with that. When you and I drink water, we drink non-salty water. We drink fresh water. Now, of all the water in the world, most of it is salty. Just 3% is not salty. Now, of that 3%, you can't get to most of that because 70% of that 3% is frozen. 30 million cubic kilometers of frozen water. It's so much frozen water, so much ice, that if you had a layer of it, 1,000 meters thick, it would cover North America. That's a lot of frozen water, people.
On land, frozen water forms glaciers, ice sheets, permafrost, and snow, but the Arctic is largely ocean, so there it takes the form of floating sea ice like icebergs. And because it's in direct contact with warming waters, sea ice will be the first to melt as global temperatures rise. In fact, this year, NASA reported that the extent of Arctic sea ice was the lowest ever recorded for January, February, April, May, and June 2016.
So the world is getting warmer and the ice is melting.
You might have realized that I chose it for that permafrost reference. So this video did end up getting 7 million views. It was likely helped because of Bill Nye, but you can kind of see how they focus specifically on the person speaking, very clear visuals, and kind of using analogies to explain and make that science more relatable. You can also find more technical heavy videos, or you can find simpler ones, but this is kind of the one that would really reach a broad audience regardless of their background. Similarly, videos can come in all shapes and sizes. You might be streaming on Twitch, or perhaps you're heading to TikTok to make shorter, more relatable videos. This is an example of Alex Danis from Alex's TikTok page, and I chose this example to kind of show you how you may make a start on a video platform and how you might introduce yourself without really knowing who you're about to reach, so kind of making your introduction as broadly accessible as possible.
Now than there used to be, so I thought I'd reintroduce myself. I'm Alex. I got a PhD in genetics from Stanford 2 years ago, and now I'm a full-time science communicator. Genetics is my favorite thing, and I'd love to tell you more about how it impacts your everyday life. But I also love things like space and marine biology, and honestly, all biology. It's all super cool. And I've been talking a lot lately about COVID-19 and vaccines, trying to make the science a little easier to understand. So if you want to learn more, click that little plus and say hi in the comments down below.
So you can kind of see that this video focused straight on Alex's face, using kind of gestures to kind of illustrate what they're pointing at, and using captions to make that content accessible. So these are two different examples, but it kind of goes to show that video may not be a form that you're comfortable with, but if you do try it, it's kind of putting yourself out there and making that content as accessible as possible. Moving on from content heavy ones, there is also Instagram. If my slides decide to work with me. So in terms of Instagram, there are different types of engagements. There are obviously posts. I've shown you kind of a screenshot of what a regular post looks like. Maybe you've scrolled through in the middle of the night looking for things to forget about what's happening in the world. There are stories where you can kind of see more transient posts kind of popping up, people sharing perhaps their cooking recipes, their pets, and so on. You've got Instagram Live, where you can kind of go live to your own followers, or maybe jump onto another account to see what someone else is saying, or be a guest on an Instagram Live. Another example is Reels, which is kind of the Snapchat story version for Instagram. No, that's a story. Reels are the kind of the TikTok version, where you get short videos, and then guides are your smaller collection of posts and stories. I was going to walk you through people who have shared science through two organizations. So one is National Geographic, and the second is ScienceSam. So National Geographic is probably a name you all recognize. It's an organization that is placed globally. They have amazing photographs of just capturing nature, and they have a lot of different initiatives. So their Instagram account here has about 150 million followers, and they've really gone all out. So you can kind of see their posts tend to be focused around wildlife, around nature. This one here is a very adorable newborn ringed seal pup. So you kind of see that photo. You've got a lot of more text that you can work with. So around a paragraph, you've got your hashtags at the end to kind of reach new audiences, as well as, again, a link for someone to go and find more. National Geographic has also got reels, so kind of videos showing different parts. This one here is of the galaxy. And they've also kind of worked on a whole series. So they've done like mini videos with people like Gordon Ramsay kind of foraging in the wild. So they've really used that big budget of theirs to kind of showcase science using posts, reels, and videos. But let's say you're a regular scientist individual, you don't have that kind of budget, and you might not have that technical expertise. There are folks like you and me kind of using Instagram for that same way. I'm going to highlight ScienceSam, or Dr. Samantha Yamin. So Sam started her Instagram a few years ago, so I would say 4 or 5 years ago, when she was still completing her PhD. And these are kind of 9 posts from 2017. And what you kind of might notice immediately is a lot of the photos have Sam's face in there because a study actually showed, a scientist selfie study that Sam carried out showed that kind of including faces of scientists makes posts more relatable, increases trust, and makes what you call scientists more accessible and trustworthy, as opposed to kind of a photo of just technical equipment or just blank computer screens kind of thing. So you can see kind of Sam putting her face in there and kind of increasing that engagement. And what Sam has really done over the past few years is document her PhD journey. So, kind of the successes, the challenges, and just showing what a day in the life of science can be, kind of that slow trek towards publication or discovery or just graduation. In the years to come, Sam has started focusing more on general science, especially during the pandemic, a lot of focus on COVID-19 science. I would really recommend following Sam if you're just curious about how to use Instagram to communicate science. Here's an example of how Sam is using guides. So she's kind of created a guide around common misconceptions around vaccines, a small business guide. So it really goes to show that you can kind of mix your personal and professional interests and really use Instagram as a space to share science more broadly. I will admit that, again, it is about putting yourself out there, and it is definitely something that you have to build your comfort with over the years. Another example are professional networking sites like LinkedIn, ResearchGate, and more. So you're going to kind of notice that the types of engagements are very similar across all the platforms. So again, you can make a post, so that's text, photo, video, polls, documents. A lot of people tend to use LinkedIn for professional updates. So you can kind of see someone has a new job, perhaps they're celebrating a 1-year anniversary. There's also portfolios, so you're kind of putting together a list of your experience, your skills, your accomplishments. And then LinkedIn also has its own version of stories where you can kind of do quick updates that only last for a few hours. An example I grabbed off my own LinkedIn page. So I helped co-organize a workshop series. I ended up writing a blog post about it. So I wrote a very simple post to kind of share that with everyone, where I wrote, this is what happened, this was an event, this is what I did, I wrote a blog post, please check it out, kind of thing. I know that a lot of you do have LinkedIn, so I imagine that you are comfortable with it. Another example is ResearchGate, which has a couple of million users, which was very interesting to me. Interestingly, most folks on LinkedIn, on ResearchGate, tend to be more heavy towards medicine, biological sciences. But this is again another example of a platform where you can create a profile and network with just other researchers or other experts in your field. Other examples include Mendeley. They're very niche to the kind of field or area you're in, but I would say LinkedIn, ResearchGate, and Mendeley tend to be the top ones. Last but not, oh, there are two more. Yeah. Another example are blog platforms such as Medium or creating your own blog. And here you kind of have three routes. First, you could create your own blog, so perhaps use WordPress or something to create one from scratch. One example is Scientists See Squirrels. So this is hosted by Dr. Stephen Hurd, who is a professor at the University of New Brunswick. Specifically, he is an evolutionary ecologist and an entomologist. And Dr. Stephen tends to kind of blog about writing, about peer review, about different aspects of academia, and it's been really interesting to watch his blog grow over the years. So that's an example of how you could create your own blog from scratch and kind of document your own journey. Then you could also guest blog. So if you don't want to go through kind of all the work of creating your own blog and maintaining it and kind of promoting it yourself, it's easier to go to an established blog network and start guest blogging there. One example is Science Borealis. This is a Canadian science blog network. So they actually syndicate, so they kind of collect other blogs that exist and help amplify them as a network, but they also have their own guest blogs. So you could volunteer to write a blog. It's about, you get to work with the editors over there. They help polish your work, and they kind of do the work to help you amplify and share your work more broadly. So guest blogging really takes that work off of you. Then there's, of course, you can publish on a platform, so something like Medium. Anyone can go and create a Medium account and publish anything they like. For example, I really wanted a space to kind of collect science communication opportunities. I didn't want to publish it on somewhere else because I wanted that ability to kind of update it as time went by. So I decided to just publish it myself on Medium. And for me, that worked really well because I could keep track of how many people were visiting, get kind of commentary or feedback straight to me, and just update it over the years. So kind of all three of these approaches have their pros and cons. If it's something that you want to do long term, that you want control over, I would say go and create a blog. If it's more of a one-off thing that you just want to try now and then, you can guest blog or maybe just publish as you want to on Medium. Last but not least, there is Twitter. So similar again to the other networks, you can do a post like a photo, a video, a poll. You can reply to other posts, you can retweet, you can quote tweet. So retweeting is just amplifying. Quote tweeting is when you add a comment and amplify it. There are fleets, which is kind of the version of Instagram stories. I don't like fleets, but maybe you will. And then you can also get very creative with how you use tweets. So you can kind of build a thread, so multiple tweets. You could do a tutorial, which is kind of a Twitter tutorial where you're walking someone through your study. You can do a live tweet, so maybe you're like live tweeting, live blogging from a conference or event, and kind of just being engaged with what's happening in a conference virtually. And then Twitter chats. So sometimes organizations host virtual chats, and anyone across the world can kind of jump into the conversation with just adding a hashtag to their post to be found. We're going to walk through Twitter a bit more, but the rules that I'm going to share are kind of applicable to all social media platforms. The reason why I'm focusing on Twitter is because it's definitely a harder platform just because the challenge is 280 characters. You have to be very concise with what you choose to include. And 280 characters may seem big enough, especially since they doubled the character limit, but it is definitely a challenge. I wanted to start off by kind of showing you what the anatomy of a Twitter biography would look like. So I've grabbed examples from Alana and Tristan, who are our two instructors for this program series. And you can kind of see that they both have their names clearly written. They are lucky enough to have a handle which reflects their name. Not everyone is lucky enough for that. And in their biographies, you can see that they've clearly signaled like Alana is a conservation biologist and a science communicator. She is working in wildlife health at Environment Canada. Similarly, Tristan, you can see his interests are science communication and education, and he's at PermafrostNet and Carleton University. So you're kind of signaling your interests and your professional affiliation. I also want to point out that there are rotational Twitter accounts, so you can have your own account as you, an individual, but you can also guest host other Twitter accounts. So this here is Real Scientist. They have about 90,000 followers. So you can just jump on, well, volunteer to jump on. And if you're selected, you can share your science more broadly for like a whole week with so many folks around the world. It's definitely interesting to keep up with these rotational accounts because you'll learn so much. So now I'm going to walk you through some good rules of thumb. And again, all of these will apply to all accounts and all platforms. I'm just using Twitter as a rule for this. So the first rule of thumb is to have a complete profile. So I'm going to use myself to critique here. The first thing is a photo. So usually a photo of your face. It can be animated. It can be your pet dog, whatever it is. Usually a photo of your face works best, but kind of keep it consistent because sometimes like I can only recognize people because of their photo on platforms, so I would say don't switch it up too much. The next thing would be your name and your degree. If you want yourself to be recognized, then include your full name. If you're going anonymous, go for it, but just keep in mind that you should just tweet like your name is on your account, or you should use your accounts like it's yours entirely. Next thing would be your handle. I'm one of those unfortunate people who can't get my name, so I am at the Spara. If you can find a way to fit in your name into a handle, go for it. If you want to get creative, maybe you want to be called Permafrost Cube or Permafrost Research, Permafrost Scientist. Like, get creative and kind of think of what your handle could be. Your biography is definitely important. You can put in your affiliation, so where are you doing research? You'll notice that I did not do that, so that's not a good sign for me. What are you researching? Where do you volunteer? Where do you serve? It's a good practice to include your pronouns if you're comfortable, and you should probably clarify views. So you'll notice that me and Alana have said my views or views mine to kind of clarify what I am writing, what I am tweeting is mine. You may want to double check your organization or department's policy to kind of clarify What is good social media usage? Can you identify yourself as being affiliated to the organization? It's good to have that in mind just in case something happens. In general, based on the research institutions that I've been with, I've never run into an issue with social media. I think one of my institutions did want like my PI to clarify that his Twitter was his Twitter account and not the lab as a whole. So it's kind of like tiny things like that you might want to double check. Just to give you an example of how Twitter would work, so you would have things like you can reply to a tweet, you can like a tweet, you can share a tweet, you can also choose to amplify a tweet using retweet, or you can quote tweet. So for example, this is a report that's coming out by the Council of Canadian Academies next Tuesday. It's about where PhD graduates in Canada end up. This report is super interesting. It's not out yet, but I'm really keen to learn more about it. So I just added a comment and I quote tweeted and shared it broadly. But what could you use your accounts for? You could use it to share research, updates, a study you read, a study you published, and a lot of the same reasons that you've mentioned earlier, so kind of keeping up with your field, engaging during conferences, and so on. In terms of more broadly, these are examples from permafrost researchers. You'll notice that hashtags and tagging accounts is always nice. It helps you amplify your posts, helps you reach new audiences. I would just recommend to not use hashtags or tag in folks excessively. Kind of find that balance, like, is that organization important to tag in? So if you are sharing research that's relevant to PermafrostNet, I think tagging in PermafrostNet would be a good idea. Tristan might disagree later. Another one is to avoid using all caps. This isn't a hard rule, but just I'm sure you all know that when someone's typing in all caps, it feels like they're screaming, and you probably don't want to convey that unless you're actually really, really excited. So maybe you just got a study published and you're just like, I'm very excited to share my new study. Like, go for it. It's just keeping an eye on your tone, which is something Tristan is going to come to in a bit. I would also add that images, emojis, GIFs, and videos, regardless of the platform, they're always good. It's always nice to read something that's not text, but I would also just implore you to keep accessibility in mind. So every single time I share anything, I make sure that the alt captions are on. So for example, if you're on Twitter, if you head to settings, well, if you attach any GIF, you'll see an option that says add description. If you select add description, you can describe the text as needed. So for example, this is a GIF that says you've got mail. I would describe this as an envelope plus the text you've got mail. And the reason why is that there are people who are reading and using social media platforms using screen readers, or perhaps they're colorblind and so on. So there are a lot of different accessibility needs to keep in mind, and just filling in these alternate captions can really make your content more accessible. And I would also add that if you're filming a video, you should try to caption it yourself. There are lots of apps that are available, lots of programs, and just manually captioning things always takes your stuff a little further. One last thing that I want to highlight is that you can use Twitter in quite a few different ways. So for example, this here is Peter Soroy, who got a paper published earlier this year? Oh, last year, February 6, 2020. He got a paper published in Science about bees. I think it was bees. I want to say it was bees. It was bees. And it was really interesting how he wrote an entire like 20 tweet thread, and he just laid out that entire paper. So you kind of see that excitement immediately, and he explains like every single part of his study. And this tweet like really made around the world. So you can kind of see 219 retweets, 1K likes. But as a result of just this tweet, journalists were able to find this tweet, and many of them were able to write their entire piece, just because they could understand how he had easily broken it down. So I would say, like, don't expect that for every tweet that you write, but if you kind of convey that excitement, if you make that science accessible, you never know how it's going to help. And in terms of this, like, this helped Peter share his research more widely and get media attention and so on. Other ways that you can kind of use Twitter, so live tweeting. I do tend to live tweet a lot just because I find that if you're at an event, keep in mind that not everyone else is there, and perhaps they're curious about what's going on. Perhaps they also want to learn too. This was important in the era before COVID-19, where not everyone could travel everywhere. So when I tend to be at an interesting event where something like I'm learning a lot of good things, or something that I'm like, hey, this is interesting, I think people might be interested, I tend to live tweet what I'm up to. So this here was a session at the Canadian Science Policy Conference in 2019, where it was kind of talking about the future of science policy and how can young researchers get involved. So that was me kind of tweeting it out. I would also say that you can write Twitter threads about things that aren't your research. So I read this really interesting book about the theory and best practices behind science communication training, which Tristan had shared. And it was a really interesting 200-page book. So I was like, I'm going to tweet it. And people were interested. If you kind of bring that enthusiasm, if you're sharing what you're up to, you will find that people will engage and people will be just as interested as you. Last but not least, I want to add that there are obviously verified accounts on every platform, whether it's Instagram or Twitter. This here is Professor Catherine Hayhoe. She is Canadian, but now she's in the US. Yes, she's at Texas Tech University. And you'll find that it's people get verified for a lot of different reasons. Maybe it's the political position they're holding, maybe they are an established expert, perhaps they're a journalist. It's sometimes not as transparent about what the verification process is, but you'll find that the verified accounts definitely are held to a higher level of trust. So maybe they have some good questions and you want to answer them, maybe you want to engage with their posts. But I do want to add that above all, being human is important. So I'm grabbing Catherine's tweets here. You've noticed that Catherine's tweeted about dogs and that there are good humans in the world. And then she's also tweeting about kind of more controversial topics. So talking about faith on a platform as large as Twitter is not always the best way to create a good conversation, but it's a reminder that when you're on a platform, you're not just a scientist first, you're also human, and there are many different aspects to your personality, and how much you choose to share is up to you, and that is something that you're going to work your comfort zone around.
The next little section, I'm going to very, very quickly go over professional organizations, because you may be interested in setting up a social media account for a lab or something bigger. And as you progress through your career, hopefully that's the sort of responsibility you might get. You might have a big organization to think about. Or you may like to host an account. And we would be delighted if members of the network wanted to host our accounts at times. I've developed a guide that will help anyone who would like to host a Twitter account, our Facebook. It gives you a lot of opportunities to share some of the latest research, share some of your work. That'd be really, really, really nice. So I'm going to give you a little breakdown on some of the things to think about when it comes to professional hosting. And then Farah is going to get us to try and practice writing some content for some different platforms. We have a variety of accounts at PermafrostNet. As you can see, we've got a Twitter account, a Facebook account, an Instagram account. At the moment, Twitter is probably one of our busiest channels where we can share information. We have a LinkedIn account, and judging by the feedback we got on the survey, I think we definitely need to focus a little bit more on our LinkedIn account. It's obviously going to be a good way to connect with members of the network. We have a Flickr group where you can share images. If you have images of any of your field work, that would be a fantastic place to share them. We can then use some of those images in some of our materials, or we can maybe use them for our Instagram account, and you can control all of the Creative Commons or other licensing that you want for distribution of any of those images on there, which is a great tool. And we now have YouTube, which is where you will find eventually the recordings of these workshops and these sessions. One of the little things that I'd like to talk about a little bit has been mentioned is tone. When it comes to social media, tone can be a very difficult thing to decide on. Quite what tone are you going to approach for your social media? Are you going to be funny? Are you going to be serious? What's the approach that you're going to take? Because it's like personality. And this here is an example of Ottawa Public Health. They just surpassed 100,000 followers. I really like Ottawa Public Health. I really like their tweets. They do a lot of regular organizational kind of tweets, and they also do some funny ones. This is one, actually, as you can see here, this was in December 2019. This was before the pandemic hit. And they were wanting to encourage people to get their flu shots. And so they did this funny little tweet where they just did like a child's drawing. And, it was a way to try and just get people to stop, take a second look and see what the message was, which is ultimately get your flu shot. I like it, but maybe not everyone does. I think if you're representing a public health organization, you want to think carefully about how the wider community, because this serves obviously a large community, the Ottawa community, on serious issues and serious topics. And so you want to make sure that your organization is happy with the tone that you're going to adopt, and you're going to want to really think about, is it going to achieve the objectives that you have? Is it going to achieve the goals that you have? So I like it, but maybe it's not for everyone, and it's a good reason to think hard about your tone. Our organization, for instance, we have a variety of types of posts, and we tend to be less humorous. We're not quite as funny, and maybe we should be funnier. But as it stands, we tend to share things like publications, people giving talks. We want to highlight our funders. And so some of the posts tend to be a little bit more formal. We try to have links, images, highlighting members of the network and presenting them in a professional and a very good light. So these are the sort of areas that we focus on for our network. Now, the thing that you really want to sort of think about as an organization is, as has already been discussed, having all of the right tags for organizations, hashtags, and messaging. And as you can see here in this example, we have some text, how we would present it on the website, but we need to then adapt that for a different platform. And in this case, it's Twitter, where you have a limited number of characters. And so this is how we would change a lengthy sort of paragraph of text into a shorter message that conveys the same information more succinctly. And here you can see we've got our funder NSERC tagged, and we have the hashtags permafrost and climate change. And this then gets converted into an actual tweet, which looks something like this. It's nice, simple, fairly straightforward. So next, what we'd like to do is have you give it a shot, give it a try, and turn some messages into posts for different platforms.
Here you can see kind of an example of how I've shared some content. Okay, now I can see this. So the first question that you should ask before you're making any sort of post on any social media platform is, what is the goal and who are you trying to reach? In these specific examples, my goal was I want to introduce myself and my research to the world. So if I was doing this on LinkedIn, I would use full sentences, proper text, and just explain, hi, I'm Farah, I'm a genomics researcher and science communicator. My research is into DNA sequencing. I'm at the University Health Network. I'm also doing research at Evidence for Democracy. And if you're working in any of these fields, please connect with me. LinkedIn does allow for hashtags, so I've kind of put in science, genomics, and science communication because I feel like those are the most relevant hashtags for me. If I was doing this for Twitter, I don't really have the luxury of words. I only have 280 characters. So what I kind of feel are the most important things to emphasize is, hi, I'm Farah. It's kind of like, hello, I'm a human being, instead of saying, hello, I'm Farah. Again, the most important point that I want to say is that I'm a genomics researcher and science communicator. I've used an emoji to kind of break up that text. And then I've summarized very clear as like, this is my research in just 100 characters or so. And I'm going to be tweeting about SciComm, SciPol, and I put in DNA. If you're using something like Instagram, you've got more text to work with. I haven't put as much text because I still want to break it up and have some space, but you can easily put in a paragraph. I would say just have mini paragraphs to break it up. And of course, the image that you use is important, and like having your face in there is definitely going to get your post to work better. And then if you're feeling more ambitious, a TikTok video, you want to keep these short, but if I was doing this, I would kind of say portrait video, focus on my face, and then you'll notice that the language that I've used for this one is very different. Instead of covering both parts of my research, I'm just focusing on genomics, and I'm really breaking down what is DNA. So it's the fact that you have a very large genetic code, that there are so many letters in your DNA. It's almost, how many Harry Potter books is it? It's bigger than the entire Harry Potter book series, and kind of how typos can lead to different changes. So now I want to turn it over to you and I want to challenge you. You'll find that there are a lot of empty slides, so you're welcome to pick any single one, drop in your name and fill it out. And my prompt here is kind of, you're welcome to use it for whatever post that you want, but you could use it to introduce yourself to the world, maybe one key thing that you learned from today's workshop, or tell me about the day in your life as you, as a graduate student or as a researcher. Tell us about your research, or have you attended an interesting conference or read a really unique study? So we're now turning it over to you. Take this time to kind of build your own social media posts. If you're curious about, if you have any questions, if you want us to gently critique your work during the remainder of this workshop, we can. And I'm going to stop talking now because it's your turn. And I wanted to briefly touch upon the challenges of social media usage. You can totally listen to me while you're working on your Google Slides. That is totally fine. In terms of challenges, I'm sure you've thought of a few of them already. The first one is your comfort zone. It's kind of deciding how much of your research or how much of your life as a scientist or your personal life that you're comfortable with sharing. For me personally, like, I'm not going to tweet about my family. I'm not going to actually tweet about specifics of my research because so much of my research involves patient genomics. But I kind of try to think about the bigger picture. So, kind of, what are the ethical or societal implications, or sharing my research once it's published. So, you kind of have to work out what your comfort zone is. Another challenge is obviously it takes time. It takes time to actually write a 280 character tweet because you have to decide what your goal is and really craft your post to make sure you're highlighting your key message and you're not kind of getting lost in extra details. For example, is it really important to share that you have a cute dog? I would say yes. Or do you want to share the fact that dog poop is somehow central to your research? So you kind of have to decide what you want to put the focus on. You also want to keep in mind that you're working with social media algorithms, and it's kind of likes and engagement that can kind of make a post go further compared to perhaps a post you put in hours to. For example, you might spend 5 minutes on a tweet and it'll do great, and then you'll spend 3 hours putting together a Twitter thread and it didn't go anywhere. It's hard to predict these kind of things. And even with, you have to keep in mind that you're building an echo chamber sometimes, and it's really about following different people with different perspectives from different countries, locations, fields, to make sure you're getting a diverse set of perspectives. That'll not only helps you grow as a person, but also reminds you that there are multiple implications to your research that perhaps you're not considering. I also want to remind you that social media is often a highlights reel where people are kind of sharing the successes and the highlights and the good parts. You're not always seeing kind of the struggle and the failures and the rejection. So it's kind of a reminder to stay human and just keep in mind that just because someone's sharing some great parts, there are probably just as many failures that they've had that same day, perhaps. It's also important to read the room. For example, I would feel incredibly terrible for any organization to try to do any event today, given that there was an inauguration happening down in the South. We're very glad that you're here today, but reading the room and kind of being aware of the bigger picture of what's happening, are there any things that might not be, that might contrast kind of what you're putting out? For example, probably wouldn't share a new study today because everyone's attention is on the news. They're not particularly open to new studies today. And the last thing I would say in terms of challenges would also include misinformation. So perhaps you see family members or friends or colleagues sharing information that isn't true, or perhaps you're called out. Maybe you made a mistake, maybe you messed up, maybe something went wrong, maybe there was a typo, and that is definitely a challenge and not always the most comfortable situation to be in. If anyone has questions about that, we can touch on it later, but in general, if you're ever in that uncomfortable situation, usually it's best not to tweet hastily or to post hastily. Kind of take a step back, consider what went wrong, what can you do to fix it, apologize, and really listen to the feedback that you're receiving. And I will acknowledge that being called out sucks. It happened to me once. Don't think it was entirely my fault, but I will take my share of the blame. And it's definitely a learning moment where you kind of have to remember, yes, what you say can be taken out of context and you have to be careful with what you're up to. That being said, I don't want to scare you with the challenges. There are just as many benefits to social media usage. We've touched on this a lot during the workshop, but I'm just going to emphasize a couple of them right now. So the first is there's a benefit of sharing your research and perspectives broadly. As Tristan mentioned, that helps increasing citation rates. It helps you reach perhaps potential new collaborators that you never thought of. You can stay in touch. For example, Jesse, who I have not seen in a year, two, I don't know anymore, Jesse, but we still manage to stay in touch over social media. You can use the same for LinkedIn, for Twitter, for Instagram. It's a way to stay in touch with colleagues and see what they're up to. It's also a chance to find new opportunities. You'll find that there are actually a lot of opportunities for graduate students and trainees in particular, but it's hard to find them perhaps because, especially right now, you're limited to emails and kind of what other people who you're meeting in Zoom meetings may know. And you kind of need to reach a broader audience to find out what's happening broadly. And social media really helps with that. It helps you find opportunities that you might not find on your own. It also reminds you to think of the broader context. By following new people, you might learn new techniques, you might get new ideas, or you might just think of a new field that you never thought about pursuing before. It helps you network virtually, it helps you meet new people, and perhaps most importantly, you learn a little and you definitely have some fun. I will definitely admit that social media has been really useful for me. I started using it properly during graduate school, and I have met so many people pretty much. Yeah, this entire program only happened because I met Tristan through social media, and I have learned a ton. So in short, I would really say try it. It'll definitely take some time for you to work out what platform you're comfortable with and how much of, like, do you only want to be there for professional use? Do you want to blur the line between personal and professional boundaries? But I would definitely say try it once, because especially right now, sharing science broadly and accessibly is important, and we especially need more permafrost researchers out in the world. And that is my pitch for you. With that, thank you so much for attending today's workshop. We'll be back again in 2 weeks with Public Engagement 101, which Tristan will be teaching.